Hello, and welcome back to the Camera Rolling Podcast. This is episode 6 of season 2, and I'm your host, Ronnie. Today, I'm going to be talking about the movie to end all romance movies, Twilight. But before I get started, I have a few things I want to address. First off, I know I was gone last week. I've been having a rough time with my mental health lately, so I've just been going through it. So I needed a break, and I was going to take a break, honestly, this week, but yeah, it just came sooner than I expected. I wasn't feeling it, so I didn't want to force myself, but now that I've got the vibe going again, I wanted to upload this week. So yeah, I was planning on taking a gap between episodes 6 and 7, but instead it ended up being between 5 and 6, so I am back. If you saw or if you're subscribed, you will have seen the announcement on the community tab, but otherwise, sorry about last week. And now moving on to regular business, as per usual, my recent watches. So the first film is a Spanish film called Piggy or Cerdita. I don't know about anyone else, but this movie has been pushed very heavily to me on Hulu. So if you are a frequent Hulu user like me, it has like all of my favorite rewatching shows. I've seen Piggy come up so many times, and I've already watched it, and it has still come up to me every single day. Anyways, it follows Sarah, a teenage girl in a small town in Spain who's bullied by local girls for her weight, which is why it's called Piggy or Cerdita. One day, she actually witnesses her bullies get kidnapped by a strange man who ends up taking an interest in her but doesn't harm her. She then has to deal with the dilemma of whether to tell what happened or let the man do what he wants with her tormentors. I thought this movie was shot really well, and it's not a surprise to me that this movie actually stems from a short film by the same name with a very similar concept. There are a lot of films that have sort of that essence of this could be a short film or this could be, longer form, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Either way, the actress playing Sarah is absolutely gorgeous and amazing. Like, she's an amazing actress. I think she plays this sort of silent, muted character very well. Plus, them calling her fat or calling her Piggy, I cannot believe it. Like, she is gorgeous. I don't know what else to say, but to me it doesn't track, but I don't know. People are still fatphobic. Also, I think the moral dilemma is such an interesting and captivating concept. So generally we have this moral dilemma: does she save the people who have been tormenting her, or does she essentially let them get their karma for being awful people to her? The only thing I don't like about this concept is that the movie centers around her weight. I think fat main characters should be allowed to be more dynamic with other struggles outside of their weight. And it's a little disappointing to see that always be the main issue when fat people have more struggles than just their weight. While yes, their weight might be the focal point of maybe their social struggles, it's not the focal point of their entire life, although I do understand that fat people do have that as part of their identity. While their weight may affect how others see them and treat them because of societal norms and just general fat phobia, it's not the only defining part of their existence, and I think that fat people deserve better and more dynamic characters. So I don't know. You'll have to let me know what you think of the film if you've seen it down below, or just in general what you think of fat characters, because I obviously am not a fat person, so I can't speak on their behalf or of what they might want from their characters. So I don't know if other people would agree with me that while the movie is great, that the main focus feels a little, I don't know what the word is, feels a little one note, if that makes sense. But anyway, the other movie that I sort of watched was Jeepers Creepers Reborn. I got bored an hour in. It's only an hour and 40 minutes, but I just couldn't sit through it. I think the first movie with Justin Long is a really fun, campy type movie, but this movie didn't have anything more interesting going for it. It's somewhere between serious and camp, and I wish it would pick a side a little more clearly, because I feel like the original Jeepers Creepers feels kind of campy. It feels like we're having fun the whole time. I also think when you hold back the specific identity or the appearance of a creature or scary character, it makes them even more anticipated for when they are on screen. But in Reborn, they almost immediately show you what it looks like. And while I do think that the practical effects are really cool and interesting, they do it in broad daylight, so it feels campy. So I don't know if that's a good thing or not. I don't know if it necessarily adds anything to the movie. I don't know. I just felt like it wasn't fully aware of itself, and it was just not hitting the same for me. So today's topic is Twilight. We all know the iconic book series and films that defined young adult fiction in the mid-2000s, and I specifically want to talk about some interesting things I noticed as I connected the makers of the film to the film itself. A lot of the discussion around the movie is the abusive and controlling nature of Edward's feelings towards Bella throughout the movies. It's been a few years since I saw the movie, so upon rewatch, I found a lot of interesting tonal shifts that made the movie seem campy as well. At the time, I think the movie was meant to be taken seriously, even though it had initially been picked up by Paramount Pictures and MTV to be adapted, only to fall into Summit's hands as they moved to be a studio that could create feature-length films. When looking at the movie in the specific context of a singular film created by a group of women that were not carried into the following films, as well as its connection to the author who would have had some involvement in its creation. Its connection to the inspiration and the original creator's background make everything come together to be the Twilight we know and loved as it premiered in 2008 or 2009, depending on where you're talking about. So to begin, Stephenie Meyer is the author of the Twilight book series and played a large role in the creation, mostly of the last few movies, but also she helped out with the first one to make sure that it stayed somewhat true to the book. If you don't know much about Stephenie Meyer, she's an American author that grew up in Arizona but got her BA in English Lit from BYU in Provo, Utah. It's also well known that she's Mormon or a member of the LDS Church, mainly because of the influence her religion has had on her literary works. It's also interesting to think about how she pretty much didn't do anything before the Twilight series. She didn't have a professional career in writing before she sat down to write Twilight. And the fact that she had the idea from a dream, then sat down for 3 months to write it, and then it getting rejected 14 times before someone finally decided it might be interesting is just insane to me. I know it's hard to get a book published by larger corporations, so it getting rejected so many times isn't really the surprising part to me. It's how loose the idea was in the first place. Like, don't get me wrong, I've had some crazy dreams that have inspired larger projects from me. But thinking about how the books and movie turned out, it really speaks to how her story doesn't have enough nuance, in my opinion. The story is fairly clear and unfortunately promotes a lot of unhealthy relationships in that it doesn't actively work to unpack any of that, but instead upholds it in a Romeo and Juliet sort of way, while simultaneously being super offensive in its use of Quaalude legends, as well as just general ignorance in other categories of social issues. It's frustrating. And of course, when she wrote it in the early 2000s, I'm sure that much of this wasn't on her mind, but when you are a white person in today's world, it just makes sense that you should probably investigate why you're using somebody else's cultural traditions or legends in your writing if that's not something that you know about. Along with the general implications of a lot of these vampires' histories or their previous identities within history is very kind of disturbing to think about, especially in that Carlisle was just doing this to people sort of without a lot of their consent. So yeah, there's a lot of issues that are like underlying that have to do with other smaller elements of the book, but again, I sort of want to speak more about just Edward and Bella and their relationship. Now, I've never read the books, so I can't speak directly to if there are any particular nuances that aren't carried out in the films. However, my podcast is generally in discussion of movies as separate pieces of work that only sometimes need more contextual evidence to further the understanding of the work. And here, I mostly want to focus on the context of the creators of the film and how that influences. Because while Stephenie Meyer is the original author, we also have director Catherine Hardwicke and writer Melissa Rosenberg, who play larger roles in the direction the film takes as well. It also helps to ground Twilight as a standalone in its creation because this is the only time all three of them work together in the series. The following movies do not have the same influencers overseeing them. So Twilight is a nice little case study in film history, to say the least. Because Catherine Hardwicke, the director, was known at the time for her work on teen angsty types of movies like 13 in 2003 or Lords of Dogtown in 2005. She also directed The Nativity Story in 2006, which I think is interesting in that she grew up Presbyterian, so her religious history is more in the Christianity vein than the LDS. But if you know enough about both LDS and Christianity, you know that they're just different sides of a pretty similar coin. However, when you look at a film like 13, it feels very rebellious against the teachings of Christianity, but harks more to her experience rebelling as a young teenager herself. Needless to say, I think her career speaks to why she'd be interested in a project like Twilight, where there's themes of both religion and rebellion at the same time. Likewise, we have someone like Melissa Rosenberg that wrote the script for Twilight, and you can see how her previous works influence her position as a screenwriter. She'd worked mostly on teen TV dramas before, as well as Step Up in 2006, which speaks more to her career as a dancer than a writer, but it's still this experience that sort of helped her come into her own as a writer. She was also involved in the Writers Guild of America strike in 2007, which plays into our understanding of how Twilight came to be, specifically because this was also around the time that she was writing Twilight. This impacted the script by cutting her timeline from 8 weeks to write it to 5 weeks, which if you've ever written anything long form, you know it's hard to write something longer in a short period of time, especially if you feel rushed. It can lead to underdeveloped areas of the story. It also doesn't leave a lot of time for revising or input from others. So thus, we have the masterminds behind Twilight the movie. So after rewatching the film as an adult, the movie takes on a whole new meaning. To take the film seriously is to suspend one's disbelief to the point that the characters are interesting and desirable. Much of the dialogue and relationship structures are rudimentary at best. It's unfortunate that the inspirations behind the romance in the film are taken from such controversial media like the works of Shakespeare or Jane Austen, as well as that of the forbidden nature of Brokeback Mountain. Because there's a lesson to be learned, particularly from something like Romeo and Juliet, that seems to be missing from surface-level interpretations of the play. To some, it may seem tragic because they both die in the end. To others, it's romantic that they loved each other so much they'd take their lives to be together forever in the afterlife, and others, it's unfortunate that teenagers would take a situation to those lengths. And yes, while being a teenager is hard and dramatic, positioning romance in the way that Twilight does is not helpful for teenagers to realize that their attraction could be harmful. The harm that's obvious within the Twilight story is that she could literally die or be eaten by vampires by choosing to date one. This, however, makes their love exciting and dangerous, which is actually appealing to many teenage girls looking to feel special or rebel against their parents. However, being eaten by vampires is not really a viable deterrent for teenagers to grasp onto. Since vampires aren't real, it's easy to fawn over people who hold similar traits to someone like Edward. The movie truly fails to uphold the true danger of their romance, which is Edward himself. Consistently throughout the film, I noticed that Edward is pretty toxic. While Bella technically plays a part in their growing relationship, Edward is almost always the person initiating their romance. Even though Bella fantasizes about Edward when she sleeps and just in her free time, she doesn't make any moves to interact with him in real life. However, Edward almost always approaches her with the mentality that he's so attracted to her that he can't stay away, yet he doesn't have the willpower to actually do so. He consistently inserts himself into Bella's life without her consent. Not only that, but the thing that bothers me most about Edward is that he's constantly gaslighting Bella into believing that it's her fault that 1, he can't stay away from her, and 2, that it's her choice to stay. It's like, if you're actively cornering someone, especially a woman, it can be assumed that the threat of leaving is no more a choice than staying. If you've ever been in a relationship where there's violence, manipulation, or some amount of power imbalance, you know that blaming the person being oppressed is part of that manipulation. So every time Edward approaches her saying he needs to stay away from her, and her saying, okay, and him not leaving is just a precursor for him later asking why she didn't leave, because she always had the choice to before things got dangerous. Which, mind you, in the first part of the movie, before it's revealed that he's a vampire, she has no reason to believe she's in any particular danger other than his word. Which, him being a man, if a man told me he was dangerous and I should stay away, I'd probably believe him. But even so, she doesn't actively pursue her interactions with him. So it would make sense that when he tells her to stay away and that he's dangerous, that she actually does that. And then him putting some amount of blame on her for not leaving is just plain gaslighting. The time that you really see her take initiative to get to know him or interact with him is when she says that he's a vampire. Like, not once before that does she follow him, have conversations that aren't just surface level polite, or really do anything to indicate that she's interested in him other than just staring at him. And that one time she's like, oh, do you want to come to, like, the beach with us? And that was about it. I don't know. It's just frustrating as an adult to reflect on how this romance shaped a lot of millennial teens at the time, because I don't think there are enough representations of healthy relationships. While I don't think that every relationship portrayal on TV or in film has to be healthy, we have to acknowledge that when it's not portrayed as problematic in a genuine way, people will take it as is. There's clear themes in the movie that indicate that the relationship is a problem, but not in a way that speaks to something healthier. One of the main themes in the movie is self-control, and it's very heavily pushed in Edward having to control himself, and this is also pushed in religious ideologies that practice things like abstinence instead of consent and sexual health. And self-control amongst teenagers is an issue that will probably never go away, as it's the nature of teens having hormonal imbalances along with undeveloped frontal lobes to the point that it makes relationships toxic, rebellion even more dangerous, and everyday life generally an emotional roller coaster. However, it's pretty obvious given the data across years of studies that pushing something like self-control isn't helpful. Not to say that people shouldn't learn discipline or hold themselves accountable for their actions, but trying to actively fight against normal urges, like those of a sexual nature, is not beneficial in the long run. Such as states that push abstinence tend to have higher rates of teen pregnancy. Granted, Twilight came out when I was around 9 or 10 years old, so I didn't really watch it or have a connection to it at the time of its release. So when I watched it for the first time, I already knew what happened. I'd already heard much of the criticism, and at that point, I was probably amongst the group of teen girls who were not like other girls, so I didn't like the movie either. At that time, I probably didn't want to conform to popular culture by being Team Edward or Team Jacob, or listening to One Direction, or wearing Ugg boots. At the time of its release and for years afterwards, I was more into anime or Romanian pop music or books by Patrick Carmen. And what I wanted to do for March was to talk about the not like other girls trope, because number one, I'm pretty sure it's Women's History Month, but also it's very important in the way that we view media, especially teen media, and the way that that shapes women in general. And whether I had done Twilight in February or March, I think it really works for both because it is a romantic movie, but it's also a story that focuses on this not like other girls trope in that Bella is seen as this like special girl amongst all the other ones, that she's so different from all the other girls, which she is, but like more in a neurodivergent way and not really a special being kind of way. And I want to briefly mention how that mentality can be seen through a religious lens, in that many religions, while the main teachings may be about service to others and putting others above oneself, it happens that there's still a focus on individuality that pushes through to make a lot of believers feel that they are also a chosen one or that they're not like others. And I didn't grow up in the LDS church. I actually grew up Christian, but I wouldn't really say that I'm a believer of that now anyway. But I do have to say that a lot of Western religions, which I've also taken some religion and philosophy classes, so I feel like I have a fairly rounded understanding of growing up in Western religion while also learning about Eastern religions and how a lot of colonization kind of messed up everybody else's religion. Anyway, I will say that a lot of Western religions like Christianity and the way it's pushed in America does tend to cultivate a sense of individual importance without necessarily holding the individual responsible. And by that, I mean that to teach people that they are so important as to convert others to the religion with no questions asked, while also removing their responsibility within the problematic nature of the process, is definitely questionable. And I could go into how missionary work a lot of the time does not actually help the communities that they infiltrate, but that just seems like a different conversation. But what I'm trying to get at is that Twilight upholds this ideology that there are chosen people to complete a certain fate that will impact everyone in a harmless yet holy way. Because the way that Edward and Bella need to be together in order to challenge the vampire-human relation, but also by creating a circumstance in which Bella has no choice but to be the vessel for this change, is so much of what I think makes up a lot of Western individuality complex. And it's interesting because it also maintains that the problem of their relationship is more problematic in the context of the LDS teachings, like that of having many children to be higher in the afterlife, rather than the problem being that Edward is controlling and obsessive and possessive, and he gaslights her and puts her in harm's way multiple times. And there's so many other problems that come to light in the later movies, but these are just generally what I gathered from the first one. There's just a lot about Edward and Bella's relationship that's so problematic and so frustrating as an adult to see that, and to look back and know that there were teenagers genuinely looking at this as something romantic or something desirable to have in a partner, and just how there are so many women specifically who end up in domestic violence situations because men think it's okay to be controlling, or they think it's okay to be obsessive and possessive and to gaslight someone into believing that they had more of a choice than they actually did. And to sort of encapsulate what I've been talking about when it comes to both religion and the toxicity of their relationship, I think Edward fully encompasses the idea of control. And this idea that you can view something as self-control while also controlling the others around you. You see this in a lot of cult-like or really strained religious situations in which somebody takes control and views it as a way of self-control, but still continues to control others around them as if that's not a problem too, which is really interesting because it takes the agency away from the other person to view yourself as having to control yourself around that person, and yet he continues to gaslight Bella into believing that she has some role in it, when a lot of the times, at least in the first movie, she doesn't take much initiative to go after Edward. Especially in the first part of the movie, she doesn't make efforts to go after him. She makes efforts, like, as a normal person, to be polite, to be nice to him, to try to at least include him in something, because it seems like he wants to be around her, and she does find him interesting. So why not invite him to the beach to go swimming, or to, I don't know, hang out? Like, these things are logical in a way that doesn't put her in a position to say, well, I can't believe you would do that. Like, no. That's a normal thing to do when someone shows interest in you, and you may or may not have interest in them. So yeah, I don't really blame Bella for any of the things that happened to her in the first movie, because they really do just happen to her. Which, again, brings up this idea of women in film not having the agency or being passive characters in their own stories, which, and again, this goes back to the beginning of film and filmmaking, and when women appear in movies, most of the time they have a passive role. They are not an active participant. Even if the story is about them, a lot of the times they will not be an active participant in their own story. Things just happen to them. They don't actually participate in what's happening around them. And this has a lot to do with the patriarchy, misogyny, and just in general, the male gaze taking control of the film industry. But that's all I really want to say on that. On to a different topic. If you were to view this movie as camp or something that's not serious, it's actually a really funny movie. I had quite a few laughs in the first half of this movie. The way that Edward and Bella interact in the first part of the movie is really interesting. They're so awkward and strange in a way that's somewhat endearing, and again, edges on being neurodivergent. It's interesting because if people act like this in real life, then people see them as strange or the weird kid, but in reality, like, that's just part of neurodivergent culture that gets sort of co-opted into film. And it's really interesting because you have to guess that a lot of the people who are writing these films are probably neurodivergent, and they're putting themselves into these characters, and as we see them on screen, it's neurodivergency coming to fruition and neurotypical people having no idea what's going on. But yeah, I just find that really interesting because if Edward wasn't so toxic and so controlling, I think they'd make a cute couple. They have witty banter and a similar kind of presence amongst their peers. They're both kind of weird type people, and even though everyone seems to like really like Bella for some reason, despite her having this very like monotone type personality, I think Edward would actually be a great addition to their weird group of friends. Like, they would be like the two little emo kids that like everyone just hangs out with. So if you take out the element of vampirism and supernatural creatures, you have this weird little romance for the first quarter of the movie. And without the supernatural elements, you might be able to make a clearer point for why Edward is actually toxic and controlling. Because if he didn't have his powers or his supposed attractive appearance, to each their own, I don't think he'd be getting away with straight up stalking Bella at different points. I think the story could have been a good lesson for teens to see why his toxicity is a problem, that they should not be together because he is so controlling. And the unfortunate things to come from Twilight are the Wattpad fanfics that idealize this dynamic, but also in the teen romance media that would follow this same sequence for many years after. Because I think we can all agree, and I know there's some domino chart that shows how everything came to be, but if you really think about it, you have something like Twilight that would inspire things like 50 Shades of Grey, but then you also have things like that One Direction fanfic that inspired the movie After and the subsequent movies, and it's really interesting because I want to bet that One Direction fanfic is somehow in relation to Twilight and its relationship to Wattpad fanfic culture. And raising a group of people, raising a generation of people to think this dynamic is okay is very concerning in the sense that there are a lot of women who may not realize that they are in an abusive relationship because their partner or their husband, boyfriend, whomever, acts the way that Edward does or has some of these same qualities that Edward does. But not only that, it brings to light the fact that men also see these movies. Men also know what these romance movies are. And whether they actively try to watch these movies, they know what the movie's about. They know what Edward does. They know what's going on in women's media to an extent that they take what they see, or they take the general consensus from women that these things are okay. And I honestly think that's more frightening than women being okay with this behavior, is that men think that the behavior is acceptable when it's very clearly not. While there's a lot of different things that I talked about earlier, and whether or not people agree with them, whether it comes to religion or whatever, I think we can all agree that having a partner who randomly shows up to places and will put other people's lives in danger just to protect you, but not in a way that's like that you're in immediate danger or anything. I don't know. There's just a lot of moments where it seems that Edward is doing things that are just wildly inappropriate. So the fact that Edward and Bella get to be together in the end is very frustrating, and I take this as the movie. Obviously, in later films, you can see how their relationship causes problems amongst their entire dynamic, their social dynamic with others, whether it be their family, their friends, or just other close people to them, that it is causing problems around them, and it could go either way. In one instance, you could see how their relationship is problematic and it is hurting other people, in the sense that they are hurting themselves by being in a relationship that is so toxic. So you could see it actually as a good lesson for teens to see that they are not rewarded for them being in a toxic relationship, but at the same time you also see them upholding their relationship by making it about this Romeo and Juliet complex, where it's just that people don't want them to be together no matter how much they love each other, even though the problem is them being toxic, not that they are together in themselves. But because they make that a main theme of the movie, that their relationship itself is the problem and them being together is the problem because they're different and not because they're toxic, it's very frustrating because it's not the problem. Anyway, I know there's a lot more criticism and analysis of Twilight that goes far beyond what I've talked about today, but I wanted to add my perspective to this conversation because I think the context behind the creation of the film is super important when discussing it as sort of a standalone. I hear a lot of talk about its relationship to the book, but not enough about the author, writer, and director involved in this and how they had such an influence on how it came to fruition. There's so much more that could be talked about when it comes to Twilight, but that's all I want to talk about today. Either way, I hope you enjoyed, and with that, keep watching movies, and I'll see you next week.